Doctors, what's the worst state a person has come in? An elderly disabled veteran had moved in with his sister and her husband and they promptly locked in their garage. They would occasionally throw bread and alcohol in there with him and proceeded to collect/cash his disability checks as they arrived. He sat in that garage in a drunken stupor and his own waste for God only knows how long, before a neighbor reported hearing crying from the garage and a god-awful smell. Once he got close enough, the paramedics and police arrived. The home's occupants were immediately arrested on a variety of charges and wheeled the victim away. They brought the gentleman into the air and the stench of rotting flesh arrived as the doors opened. He was sitting up and leaning forward with a plastic shopping bag clutched in each hand. He was wearing those bags like socks and held on until we got him settled into a bed. The technician and I began to gingerly remove the bags from his feet and found all the flesh to be missing from the ankles down and the bones covered with maggots. He was a diabetic, and as he lost circulation to his extremities, they rotted and the maggots ate away all the dead flesh, ironically keeping him alive. There were only bits of flesh remaining between the toes. Then as we began to disrobe him further, we found more maggots crawling out of his genital parts and anus, eating him from the inside out. We put on full hazmat suits and wheeled him to the reverse ventilation shower to bathe him and make him more comfortable. I remember finishing his shower and carrying him like a child back to a waiting bed. We then wrapped him in heated blankets. That was when he said the only thing I heard him say the whole time. Just a simple thank you. It was clearly the nicest thing that anyone had done for him in a long time, and it was the most meaningful thank you I've ever received. That poor gentleman did not make it through surgery, amputations etc., and his body just gave out from the shock of it all. This is one of the most horrible things I've ever seen, and the level of human depravity that inflicted this on this man is still something that angers me. Incidentally, both his sister and her husband were convicted on numerous charges and both received life sentences. There's little solace in that, but it doesn't dull the sorrow I feel for that man. Doctor here. Worst shape I saw in the air was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He still had a weak pulse when he arrived, but the exit wound had half of his brain just peeking out of it. He didn't last much longer, and we called the code not long after. Interestingly, the entrance wound was tiny and barely noticeable. This was one of my first trauma cases in medical school. What I remember most was that he had some of the bluest eyes I have ever seen, and he seemed almost hauntingly peaceful. It makes me very sad to think of what emotional turmoil he must have been going through when he pulled the trigger, and I feel terrible for what his family must have experienced, so close to the Christmas holiday as well. A nurse here. About 2 weeks ago we had a young guy who was in an argument with his partner while off his head on illegal substances. Ended up stabbing himself in the chest 7 times, including once through the heart. Surgeons had to operate while he was in our department and he went into cardiac arrest twice, but we were able to bring him back. Ended up transferring him to a specialist trauma hospital, but heard that about a week later he died on intensive care. Lab scientist in hospital, so not doctor but a few that stuck out. Diabetic patient with severe necrosis of the foot and septic. Amputated shortly after arrival. The smell is something you wish you hadn't experienced. Elderly male. Self-inflicted gunshot wound to the chest. Tried to shoot himself in the heart. Missed and then waited 3 days to come in. Severely anemic from blood loss. The patient's son's reaction to hearing his dad tried to kill himself sticks with me. Seeing a 40-something male breakdown. I'll never forget that one. Worst one was an accident on a farm. An irrigation unit. The massive one's about 50 feet tall. Fell on a guy and absolutely crushed his femur and severed his femoral artery. I'm not joking when I say the room was covered in blood. I gave that man 10 units of blood before he was shipped to a higher care facility. All 3 lived during these visits, but I'm surprised any of them did. Not a doctor, but I think I have a story that can satisfy your needs. There was a case in Poland in 2013 where an ambulance was called to a work-related incident in a stonecutter's shop. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics were led to a man who was working a stone siding machine. He was calmly sitting on the floor, responsive and awake, only a little hazed, yet he was immediately choppered to the hospital. Report says that due to unknown issue, the machine activated when the man was doing something, unloading I believe, on its operational end, and that it trapped the man's head between moving parts. In an attempt to free himself, the man jolted back, freeing his head, but his face was left inside the machine. This man arrived in the ear with a gaping hole, where his face should be, from right eyebrow through entire nose, both cheeks, to his chin. He had pieces of skull crushed, and basically half of a millimeter of torn, mangled flesh covering it. His face was sent with next transport, when it was found by police. Several hours later, story has a somewhat good ending. It was based a first successful full face transplantation, with successful recovery. Doc here, had a nurse come grab me while I was charting. Doc, you need to see room 6 right now. For those of you who don't work in the ER, when one of the nurses tells you to go see a patient, you run. I take a few steps towards room 6 and the smell of rotting flesh hit me like a truck. I gagged on the spot, and this is during COVID times. I'm masked. I peer through the glass doors of room 6 and noticed a well-appearing young female. Because she looked so well, I knew I could spend an extra minute taking a quick detour to find a handful of alcohol swabs that I promptly opened and shoved in my mask to help quench the smell. I walk into the room and find this young 30-year-old female with her leg inside a trash bag, sitting next to her parents and family. They do not seem fazed by the rancid smell. Meanwhile, I hear one of our veteran nurses vomiting in the background. I introduce myself to everyone and ask what brought the young lady to the ER and why her leg was in a trash bag. She starts not by talking, but by simply removing the trash bag, and there I saw it, a 6x8-inch necrotic, fungating tumor protruding from her tibia. She then proceeds to explain. It started 6 months ago with a cut that wouldn't heal. It then changed to appear like a fungal skin infection. She googled it and was confident in the diagnosis. She decided to treat it by starving it of sugar and going on a sugar-free, vegan diet. Eventually she convinced her whole family to do the same in order to help treat the infection. And then about a month prior to her visit today, it was too large and painful to even walk around. So she's been living in her room at home taking virtual online college courses. She added on that she's lost 30 pounds since the infection began siphoning the nutrients away from my body a few months ago. Because it grew/developed so slowly, her family and herself were completely acclimated to the smell and didn't notice anything. By this point in the conversation, I heard another nurse vomit. I then sat down and delivered the bad news that this was not a fungal infection and likely advanced cancer, that we would be admitting her to the hospital for further workup and surgical resection. I followed up on her inpatient testing the next week. Innumerable metastatic tumors to both her lungs. I never saw the biopsy results, but my guess is melanoma vs squamous cell. Poor girl is probably dead by now if she didn't hit the lottery with immunotherapy for metastatic melanoma. Not a doctor, a nurse, a mentally disabled man who was also blind and deaf who lived with relatives. Apparently he lived locked away in the basement and they would just bring him down bread and peanut butter and water to eat, and that's all he had eaten for over 2 years. The police were called when the neighbors saw an emaciated bearded old man crawling around the backyard naked and confused. Guy comes in, leg wounds full of maggots, covered in filth, lice in his hair and beard, emaciated and starving. I remember receiving him from the emergency department, trying to calm him down because he couldn't see or hear and was mentally disabled. We washed him and cut his hair and deloused him. Do you know how people always complain about the hospital food? I have never seen a patient more appreciative of getting 3 square meals ever. We would signal to him by taking his hand gently and touching it to his mouth that dinner was in front of him, and he would get a look on his face like it was the best thing that ever happened in his life. He always ate every last morsel, and we ended up ordering him double portions until he put on a good 40 pounds. He was with us for about 3 months awaiting placement. He went from 90 pounds to 130 pounds in that time. He was actually very sweet. It makes me sick that his family treated him like that. I'm not sure whatever happened to them, but I know there was an investigation. Not but surgical staff. We got a call about a person with a large infected area, but no other information besides the patient being around 500 pounds. We set up the bariatric bed and the standard wound washout pack and wait. Anesthesia calls to say we need all hands on deck and to get peppermint oil ready. We use peppermint oil for cases where the odor will be horrible to dab on our masks so it's no too intense. Anesthesia inpatient, and a few transporters due to wait. Roll into the room and a horrible smell fills the air. We ask where the wound is, and the patient says wounds are all over my groin and stomach. We asks if they know how the wounds came about, and response was no. Patient goes to sleep, and we remove the gown and blankets to begin. The patient had 6 huge gaping wounds, 4 on stomach and 2 around groin. The wounds were green and black, which meant they've been open for a while. We start irrigating with saline and antibiotics, and suddenly maggots start pouring out of the other wounds. The sight and the smell caused myself and 2 others to start vomiting. We remove some dead skin and irrigate more until the wounds are a fresh pink color, and until we saw no more maggots. We pack the wounds, and we set up some more procedures for the next few days to get this patient back to normal. During the next washout, we notice more odor, worse than the day before, and it smells like dead bowel. Patient's colon was destroyed and rotting from the infection and the maggots, and so much was compromised that at that point there was nothing else we could do besides make this patient comfortable for passing. We found out after patient passed, according to the patient's mom, that patient was on insulin and refused to use new needles every time. So they use the same needle repeatedly in the same couple of spots, and has been doing so for over a month before the infection started becoming noticeable and unavoidable. Mom tried to get patient to come to hospital for weeks when she noticed the smell, but patient refused until it became the mess that I described earlier. Doc here, 26-year-old girl, unrestrained passenger riding with a drunk driver. Her head went into the windshield and popped the whole windshield off the car. Her skull was fillet open from the forehead up, brain completely exposed and falling out of her skull, largely intact but horribly swollen. Rest of her face and body was essentially unmarked. She was breathing on her own, but not moving purposefully. She got intubated, taken to the operating room. I asked the neurosurgeon what the plan was, and he said, I'm just gonna cut off the part that's sticking out. She had a partial lobotomy. Skull was left open with the hope the swelling would go down. She was basically brain dead that night and died a week later. Driver was drunk, but had a seatbelt on. Walked out of the ER that night. Worked in Aurora's business office, getting patient info for billing. The worst thing I have ever seen personally was a car rear-ended at ungodly speeds. 2 little girls in the back. One luckily turned out to have minor bruises and cuts. Thought her condition was worse due to her sister's blood covering her. The other little girl was mangled more than any child should be. Her dad was wheeled in after his daughters, and we made eye contact. This was my 2nd year in the ER. I've seen some stabbings, shootings, car Olivers, sheet metal slicing people up, semi-wrecks that ripped limbs off people. Seeing gore wasn't new to me, but seeing this man stare made feel so cold I nearly fell due to my legs feeling like they would give out. He did what he could, telling me names of his daughters, age, or their info for the staff to work. I got them in, and he asked me if they will be okay. I told him truthfully I can't answer that as I'm not the guy to know. I will ask for him, and assured him that they are in the best hands. Right as I mentioned that, the head surgeon walks in, introduces himself. He asks, I need to open your daughter's head up in order to get some pressure off her brain. I need your signature before I can do all this. At that moment the father blurts out, yes, anything to save her life. Is my other daughter okay? Can I see them? He begins asking millions of questions, and the surgeon calmly explains he cannot at the moment. They need to some more stuff to make sure everything is okay. I think the surgeon didn't want the dad to see how his one daughter was. The father signs. Surgeon thanks him and promises he will do everything he can to save her life. As the surgeon left, the father immediately hugs onto me from his bed and starts bawling. He very loudly told me, don't take them. Don't take them from me. Take me instead. I understand it wasn't aimed at me, and more a prayer. I'm technically not supposed to touch patients, but I hugged him back and didn't let go until he did. His wails shook everything in my body as I watched him slowly spiral down more and more into this primal cry. I of course cried with him, not the single manly tear or anything. It probably looked like that one picture of Kim Kardashian crying. We cried for what was ours, I assume, and he finally let go and asked if I needed to go finish any other paperwork. I mentioned I can sit here and fill out my paperwork if he needs me to. He politely asks if I can. I ask him about his daughters. Hobbies. Favorite color. Favorite movies. As I'm finishing up, a nurse comes in and explains to the father one of his daughters is completely stable. They originally thought she was bleeding really bad, but it wasn't her blood, but it is from the other daughter. She is in surgery, and so far everything is looking good. Everyone in the room lets out a collective relief sigh, and he thanks the nurse. I tell him I now unfortunately have to return to work, but will give him any news I can, if I can. He thanks me and says he's so sorry for crying all over my shirt. I laugh and say it's better than poop or blood, and he laughs back. Work goes by, and he is discharged with nothing major. The next day I come into work. I ask my charge nurse, I really need to know if that little girl made it, or if you know at all. At that time, I assumed that family's mother was there thanking nurses, and come up to me explaining who she is. Thanks me 1,000 times for comforting her husband, she blurts out, before I can get a word out, and just told me her daughters are going to be okay. The one needing surgery is already showing every good sign that you can with that surgery. She hugged me and thanked me, calling me a hero. I thank her, but ask her to thank the nurses as they did the real work here. After all the guts, broken bones, death, and pure monstrosities I've seen, that father stare made me feel so vulnerable and weak. I will never wish anyone to ever experience what that family went through. I don't want this read like woe is me. I saw this bad thing, but this story will stick with me forever. It woke me up at the ripe age of 20 and taught me to cherish everything. After all, I've seen how fast something can be taken away from anyone. I'm so happy the story ends up happy. And the last thing I heard was the little girl wishes to be a nurse to save people, just as she was saved. Sorry for it being so long, but this one stuck with the staff forever.